Hi everybody, thanks for coming along. My name is Martin McManus. First off, I have to admit, I usually do a presentation with slides here, but due to some technical difficulties, I'm not able to get the slides up on the screen itself. It's because there's an old lead there, and I've got like a new computer, so it doesn't work. So unfortunately, you won't be able to see the slides. But if anybody wants them, just write. I'll get a piece of paper to write down your email address, and I'll send them on to you that way if you want to do that instead. So what I'll be doing this evening then is just reading from the slides, and I hope I can still draw people's attention just by speaking with slides in front of me. So yeah, you'll have to look at me for the evening. I was hoping just to have the attention over here, but it's all eyes on me for the moment. So I apologise now first before I say this for the people that've been here before. I haven't come up with any. I usually start with a joke, and I haven't come up with any new material. But there's a couple of people that've been here before, so it's a mental health joke. So I don't give the punchline away now. What do you call something that twitches and lives at the bottom of the ocean? A nervous wreck. It does get better than that, I promise. So thanks for coming along. You would have seen the slide or the leaflets which said "Are the blind leading the blind?" I think there was some leaflets I handed out that I put around the towns and posters.
I only saw it on the newsletter, newsletter. So
right here, so how's it going? So the title now is "Are the Blind Leading the Blind? Exploring Theories of Modern Psychology." So in these talks, I'm going to talk about what psychology gets right and where it's going wrong. So I'm going to start off with where things are right, the common sense sort of things that it understands about the human mind and about people, and then go into where it gets things wrong. That's the sort of what the talks will be focused on. And I'll keep it all sort of simple. The language I'll use, hopefully, will just be all simple enough. And you have to go on. Hopefully it's simple enough to be common sense. I won't use any elaborate psychological jargon. I hope to just keep it so people can understand it. And if you do catch me using any complicated psychological jargon, please stop me and ask for clarification if I have said something that isn't clear. But there will be time for questions and answers at the end as well. So, shame you can't see the slides, but in this slide I've got a big Longford flag up in the corner here. So just to give you a bit of information about myself, I'm born and raised in Longford. I can trace my great grandparents on both sides back to North Longford and South Longford. So I'm purebred Longford. All right. So that's I don't know anybody in my ancestors that's not from Longford. So you've been here a while. So and I'm also an ESB baby. I think my parents were both worked in the ESB, so I'm a product of the ESB. So also my background, I'll give you a bit. I went to St. Mel's College and got educated there. Had a decent education there. Father Garvey was there at the time, so people know him. He was pretty strict. You wouldn't want to mess with him. And then I went to Maynooth University. I studied did a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Ancient Classics. And finishing that, that's not going to get you a job. It's an interesting degree, but it's not really going to get you much of a job. So I was always interested in psychology, and I ended up doing a postgraduate diploma in psychology. I want to do a master's in psychology. And I've also done a diploma in cognitive behavioral skills and studies. That's basically looking at how people interpret reality and if they're trying to help them to see things more clearly. Also helping people with if they've got some phobias or things like that. If they're scared of something, trying to help them to change their behavior so they're able to overcome their fears. That's pretty much what I learned while I studied in England. So that's cognitive. That's some of my academic background. Some of that's useful. Like I've got the business cards there, and I've put up posters, and it does say I've got a master's and a diploma and things like that. But a lot of the stuff I learned wasn't that useful either. A lot of the stuff was just kind of jargon, really. It was kind of, and it didn't help me to understand people in general. A lot of the learning I had to do was on the job, meeting people face to face, rather than the sort of theoretical stuff that I learned through psychology or sociology and things like this. So I've worked for about 10 years in addiction and mental health services, and I've met many different characters. Worked in prisons, worked in police cells, worked in psychiatric wards, worked in community centres, visited people in their homes, all these sort of things. and I've met very, very decent people with very, very difficult stories. So that's really taught me a lot. That taught me far more than I ever learned in academia. So just getting to know those people, the stories. And I love science as well. Science is, I'm a bit of a science geek in many ways, because my two science subjects in St. Mel's in secondary school were physics and chemistry. So I always loved science. I did pretty well in it. So I always love digging into things and trying to figure things out and using the scientific method to figure things out, how things work in the world. So I try to apply that in everything I do. And yeah, I've dug in. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there, or a lot of misinformation out in our world. You have to be very careful where you go to get accurate information. So it's useful that I have these sort of qualifications and I understand the scientific method. So I'm able to do some research myself and dig into these things and get past the pseudoscience or the nonsense that's out there. I just want to share my insights. I've come back. I was away for years. I lived in New Zealand for a couple of years. I lived in England for about 6 years. But Longford was always calling me home. So I remember being in New Zealand, in Wellington, and just thinking, I just don't belong here. I need the countryside again. I need to get back home. And all of my talks, I hope they're all based on common sense. And I think sometimes when we're getting carried away with ourselves, the best people to give us a good dose of common sense is our parents or somebody around us. Because I remember when I was about 25, 26, I've told this story before, so it's like my cliche now, but our catchphrase. I went to the theatre twice and the opera maybe once in the space of a month, and I thought I was very cool. I thought I was with the times. And I told my father this. My father just said to me, "Don't forget the ball." So it's kind of just keeping you grounded. That's what you need at times. Also, part of this, on the leaflets and part of the service I provide, the psychotherapeutic services, I talk about common sense, science, and the Catholic faith. So for me, I was a bit of a rebellious teenager. I drifted miles away from the faith, and only over the last couple of years I've come back to it. I think I drifted away from it because I saw the hypocrisy and the scandals and all this sort of thing that was happening in the world. But then over the last couple of years, I really got to investigate what is the Catholic faith, what it actually is, and you dig into the philosophy of it, the theology of it, and the history of it. So that's brought me back to the Catholic faith. So that's core to my work as well. So I must move this chair. Keep on hitting. Yeah, I'll trip over.
The thing isn't working, is it?
No, I don't. Yeah, I couldn't get it hooked up first. So yeah, unfortunately. But I can put it on the slides after. Yeah. One thing before I begin this presentation as well, I'm not a medical professional as well. While I will be talking about some things related to the medical field, I'm not a medical professional, so I can't give advice out about certain things. If there's certain things that make you sort of weary or skeptical about certain things, still you have to go see your doctor and sort of get these things checked out. So I can't give a diagnosis, or I can't give advice that way. So just nobody sues me tonight. All right, that's pretty much it. So why deliver these talks? That's why do I think these talks are important for people? And I've got a couple of quotes here, and it talks about, first one's from Aristotle, who was a famous Greek philosopher, and he talks about the least deviation from truth will be multiplied later 1,000-fold. So we have to know what is the truth. Otherwise, and get back to the sort of foundations. Otherwise, things just really get out of hand. And Aristotle's saying that the truth is so important. So I'm hoping to deliver the truth here, as well as I can see it, and I hope that impart that to you then. Also, there's a father, Egidius Dulin as well. He wrote a brilliant book called Philosophy for the Layman back in the 1940s or so. Excellent book, just. And he talks about how an error in definition is always fatal. So that again, that comes back to just getting your foundations right. If you don't have your definitions right, if you don't understand man, if you don't understand human beings, then you're on the right. You're going to be off on the wrong path straight away. So this is one that's a bit more crass. I was kind of debating whether to include it, but there's a lyric by the band The Libertines. I don't know if anybody knows The Libertines. They were a famous band back in the early 2000s. and there's a lyric from one of their songs. They're kind of I don't know how to describe them, but they're kind of punky in a way. But one of the lyrics is, cornered, the boy kicked out of the world kicked back a lot effing harder. So if you're kicking out of the world or trying to kick out of reality, that'll come back at you 10 times as hard. And I learned that lesson a few times in my rebellious years, but thank God I was able to get through them. So the talks, maybe just getting back to the root, getting to the root of psychological problems in our current times, because we all know people are cracking up all over the place. We all know family members or ourselves who have had experiences with psychological distress, and we can see it. Like, I mean, it's just, if you just take a moment to step back and just analyze things, you realize things are bad. Like, people are cracking up. Like, and you know, like, psychotherapists have never been busier. Psychiatric wards have never been fuller. The pharmaceutical industry has never been richer because of all the drugs. So this is what's happening. So it's just trying to understand what's causing all this. Why is this happening? And that's what I want to explain in these 4 talks. There's a 4-week plan. Some of you might have seen the leaflets already, and it's on my website as well. So one of the next talk is, this talk's more about, it's about biological psychology. It's kind of a critique of modern theories in biological psychology. The next talk is about developmental and social psychology. The talk after that is about cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is just how you think about the world, how you learn, how you memorize things. That's what cognitive psychology relates to, and personality psychology. And then the last talk kind of comes more towards the faith. The first 3 talks don't talk that much about the faith. It's there at the core of it, but it's not explicit. So the last talks more explicitly about the faith. So I hope with the first 3 talks you'll see the errors, and then the 4th talk is kind of just saying, well, there's a solution here, and I hope I'm able to guide people along there. So I'll just give a brief definition of psychology. This is modern psychology. I won't get into the sort of, there's a thing called etymological understanding of words, which is when you look at the base root of the words itself. So that's when you try to understand what does psychology actually mean. It's psych and logia, which is the Greek words. But I won't get into that right now. Just, I'll leave that to the last session. But I'm more looking at the modern definition of psychology. And it talks about the science of behavior. It's about the science of behavior and the mind. It includes study of the conscious and unconscious phenomenon, as well as feeling and thought. This is an important line. It talks about psychologists seek an understanding of the emergent properties of brains and all the variety of phenomena linked to these emergent properties. That's really important, because that's sort of indicating, when you talk about emergent properties of the brain, it's almost indicating that it leans towards suggesting that consciousness or our sense of self is a biological thing. That's what it's sort of suggesting, rather than understanding that it's a spiritual thing, or our conscious awareness of ourselves is a spiritual thing rather than a biological thing. I hope that I'll make more sense as I go through the talk, and that's something I'll come back to as well. So basically, biological psychology, I'll start with that first. It's just basically talking about the interaction between our physiology and our mind, and how our body affects our mind, how our physical processes affect our mind and our ability to think and learn and memorize and these sort of things. So that's what biological psychology focuses on. It's that connection between the mind-body phenomenon, or mind-body connections. That's the main focus of biological psychology. And it looks at things like how we think about things, how we learn about things, how we feel about things, how we sense things, and how we perceive things, and how our biology and our body affects those things. All right? That's just a very brief definition of biological psychology. it's not unusual. I don't want to complicate this too much because it's common sense. It's just talking about, we all know that if we have if people go on like, somebody acts in a weird way and it's like, oh, I was dropped when I was younger, and then it's, that explains it, like, So it's that sort of way. We know that if somebody's affected by, if your brain's affected in a certain way, if you bang it badly, like I have an uncle-in-law, he's rest in peace, he's passed away since, but he fell off a roof and he damaged his head, and obviously he ended up in a disabled after that. Like, we know these things. They're simple enough. If you damage your body, it's going to affect your ability to operate in the world. That's kind of what biological psychology is, pretty much. So I don't want to. It's not trying to complicate things. These are pretty straightforward things. It's a lot of common sense. Like, the air we breathe is going to affect us. If it's really smoggy, or we can't breathe right, or we're in certain environments where it's stuffy, or it's really hot, or it's really cold. These sort of things will affect us. Our body will react in certain ways. So it's just those sort of common sense things. If we're living in cities that are full of smog, we're not getting the air quality that we need. These things are going to affect our psychology, going to affect our mood, going to affect the way we see things. Also, the chemicals we ingest. I think people have heard of, like, asbestos poisoning and things like that. These things affect our mind. They affect our ability to function in the world. And also the foods we eat. If we're eating just absolutely, sugary food constantly, all the time, like, it's just going to affect us. We're going to be constantly high and sort of agitated. Like, you see that in the States, where kids in the US are diagnosed with ADHD at about 6 to 7 times the rate of kids in France. Now, one of the things in that is definitely the diet. The French have a far better diet than the States. The States do over-medicate their kids as well, but one of the things is they definitely have a better diet in France, and that explains some of the ADHD amongst kids as well, because they're constantly just hyper, So the theory behind biological psychology is, if you fix the biological problem, if you can sort that stuff out, if you can figure that stuff out, then you can fix the mental problem. So that's the theory. So if you can get the biology right, then you can get the mind right. So there's truth in that. Like, if you're certain things, as I said with nutrition or the environment you're in, if you change those environments, then your mind can improve and you can start seeing things a bit clearer. So there is truth in that. But here's where it kind of gets a bit problematic. Because before we implement that idea or that hypothesis or that theory of if our body affects our mind, we need to say, well, who's defining what is a normal reaction and what's an abnormal reaction? Who defines what's a good behavior and who defines what's bad behavior? So if you have somebody, if you're coming to a doctor, or you're going to a psychologist, or you're going to a psychotherapist, they'll have a certain idea of what is good behavior and what is bad behavior, and they'll have certain criteria that they will be looking for to define what is good and bad. It's quite common. Like there's a thing called it's big in psychiatry, which crosses over in psychology. Psychiatry and biological psychology are very similar. There's a thing called the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, and it's that was developed in 1978, and initially that had 36 types of diagnosis in it. So they had 36 types of. You went into your psychiatrist, and they had 36 criteria or diagnosis that you could have, and by 2013, that's gone up to 276. So it's gone up about nine times. Like, so the chances of you going in, if you ever, unfortunately, really, if you ever ended up having to visit a psychiatrist, the chances of you getting diagnosed with something are pretty high. Like, 276 things that they could say, this is what you have. Like, so a lot of that stuff is very, very questionable. So you could go into one psychiatrist. There's a thing called the inter-rater reliability. Basically, that is a way of say I'm a psychiatrist, and Pádraig here is a psychiatrist, and somebody comes in to sort of that has problems, and somebody comes in and sort of we assess them, and I might give this person that comes in a certain diagnosis. Say I give them a diagnosis of depression, and then Porrick there might give them a diagnosis of like anxiety or something like that. So it often happens that the reliability between the different professionals is really poor. When you look at the statistics, it's quite low, the inter-rater reliability. It's like if somebody came in with a broken arm, that one doctor diagnosed with a broken arm, the other person diagnosed with a broken leg. It's that bad, and it's that important as well, because if you get the diagnosis wrong, it does lead to different medications, different treatments, and it can cause all sorts of problems. So it's very careful who decides who's right and who's wrong, and what is good or what is bad. Also, yeah, there's there's also loads of theories about what chemicals cause certain behaviors. So people might have heard about the serotonin. It might be it's quite popular. It's quite a popular theory, but there's not much evidence behind it. It's a serotonin that affects it's linked to depression. Okay. When you actually dig into the science behind these things, there's not much evidence to back it up to say that serotonin has that big an impact on depression. Although we've been dosed with this propaganda and marketing campaigns by pharmaceutical companies that it does. So you have to be very careful and you have to be pretty skeptical as well when you're kind of looking at these things. So that's one of the chemicals that suggests. The other one is called dopamine, is another chemical. And that's related to, apparently this suggests that's related to schizophrenia or psychosis. Again, there's not much evidence to suggest that treating people with chemicals that increase dopamine or decrease dopamine leads to any improved outcomes for these people as well. So there's a lot of questionable science out there. And once you dig into it, you realize that there's not much evidence for a lot of these theories, even though they're very popular in today's world. So. Also, there's when it comes to working with people, I think I've worked with many people. I've worked with different people that have had some really, really difficult stories. Like they've been through hell there on earth. Like some of the stories I've heard, they've been just really tough childhood stories where there's been abuse or things like that. And then they've maybe hid out at the world because of their behavior. But nobody got to know them enough to figure out that actually their behavior was due to abuse or due to the volatile home they found themselves in when they were young. And oftentimes it gets diagnosed as a medical condition. This isn't I'm not having to go with medical professionals here. The system they're in sometimes doesn't allow them to sit down and get to know the person because they're so rushed and they're so busy. And I've seen that. Sometimes it's more callous than that, but a lot of times it's because they just don't have time. So oftentimes it gets missed, these stories, and somebody gets diagnosed with a medical condition when actually it's because they've had trauma in their life, So
it seems like that when somebody goes in for help, they always get some form of medication.
Yeah, that's how it's going at the moment. There is people talking back against it, but it's been going on a long time. So. You can't see this slide. I've got a picture of a nice, cute dog here. It's a nice slide. But one of the things this is further exploring the hypothesis that biology affects our minds. But this can be taken to an extreme, though. It can be taken to the extreme that we're just biological entities, and that's all we are. And that's not what we are. As human beings, we have a soul and a body. So if you take it to the extreme, the biological approach, and you don't believe that a person has a soul, you might start just treating them like they're just like they're an animal. And there has been some psychologists that have done that. That there's the likes of I think it's Professor John B. Watson and Professor B.F. Skinner. These are big names in psychology. They're very influential in psychology. And these men thought that they could just make humans into what they wanted them to be. They said, like, just give me a child and I'll make them into whatever you want them to be. Almost like they were just a dog. that could just be trained to do whatever tricks they want them to be, and they were convinced of this, and they did really try to do it, and that's a part of psychology that's still there is another school of psychology that attacks that school, but it was very influential in psychology. So once you start believing people are just animals, you end up treating them as such. So I'll just take a drink there. So these things sound, they kind of all sound sort of speculative. I mean, like in terms of, this is sort of theoretical stuff. But if you get the theoretical stuff wrong at the very top, it filters down into society then as well. So if you don't get your understanding about human beings right, you don't get your understandings about depression right, you don't get your understandings about anxiety right, that will all filter down into society. And this is what, then you see the errors of these come down into society. And I've worked in the field, so I've seen it. I've seen some terrible things happening. Well, the first thing is mass medication, as Ursula said earlier. It's phenomenal, and I'll go into some of the statistics in a minute about that. But that's one of the major things that's happened. There's so many people on psychotropic drugs. That's what they're called. They're just drugs for the mind. That it's a huge business. And I've seen people pumped. I've seen people because people they believe so much in this model. They believe it so dogmatically, really. That they will actually force people to have, like, forced injections, forced electroshock. This is stuff happening in New Zealand. It's not like a third world country or something like that. This is supposedly one of the most progressive countries in the world. And this is what's happening when I was working on a psychiatric ward. So if you keep on pushing this model, you'll force your ideology on someone else. Some people are difficult. Some people that have mental health problems can be difficult, no doubt. And sometimes, force might be necessary. But the amount of times I saw force on people that weren't like small women, like that just they didn't, and that maybe were challenging the doctor. Smart women as well. If you talk back to some of these people, it can cause you a lot of problems. And this is happening it's happening in New Zealand. I haven't worked in Ireland on the psychiatric wards, but I've heard stories as well, and I know people that have had some shocking experiences. One of the pretty worst, the worst one, I sat on on psychiatric ward meetings quite often as well, and maybe I was a naive country buddy in a way, or whatever it might be. I remember sitting on these meetings and hearing some of the language that was being spoken, and I thought, a lot of the staff might have been burned out, but there was some of the language was absolutely dreadful. I remember one comment stuck out. There was a woman who was in a lot of distress, and she was a bit of a handful on the ward, but one of the psychiatric nurses said that she was feral. It's like, this is horrible language to be using about somebody that's on the ward. And if you're using that language, imagine you might think, oh, well, they just use that behind. But that language comes out into your work then. If that's the way you're speaking behind closed doors, the language does come out into your work then. It's bound to. I'm not saying I'm no angel. I've been stressed out myself at times, and sort of probably not done the right things. But that's not something. That's far removed from how we should be treating people. But the other thing with that as well, one of the errors, once we get these things wrong about human beings, and we don't understand that actually human beings have a soul, and that they should be treated with dignity, should be treated with respect that they deserve, is that this medication also causes mass numbing. And people might say, well, that's not too bad, if you're numbing your emotions. But if you numb your emotions, there's things you lose that connection with people. You lose that empathy with people. Oftentimes you kind of just become so flat, and you just don't care anymore. You don't even feel anymore, and you can just lose all sort of sense of vitality. Having worked with, you can often tell with people the vitality that's in them in their eyes a lot of the time, or the way they hold themselves, or the way they just have a bit of life about themselves. You can see that in people, and sometimes these medications just they take all of that away, and then you're just left in a sort of, you're left kind of drooling almost, and I've seen that plenty of times, and no matter what the person is going through, I that might be useful every now and again. It's like alcohol might be useful every now and again just to take the edge off, but it's not a long-term solution. So that's what's often happening, and these drugs are very addictive as well. So that's just some of the information about. I'll talk a bit more about I've got some stats here about the amount of people on drugs. With about this isn't just psychiatric drugs. This is drugs for physical health as well. So 60% of over 65s in Ireland are on 5 drugs or more a day, with 22% on 10 or more drugs daily. This is a crazy amount of drugs. Like, and if any doctor tells you they know what's going to happen when all these drugs are combined, they don't. You can't predict. If somebody's on 10 different drugs, you can't predict the interactions between them. It's just not possible. And if the doctor said it's just, so maybe the doctors it might be ignorant of that, or they get so much pharmaceutical propaganda themselves, they might just think this is all good. Also, when it comes to psychiatric drugs, 1 in 5 people in Cork City are on Valium. 1 in 5 to 20%. I worked in Cork City for a while. I worked in homeless shelters for a while. I was chaotic. It was like I only lasted about 2 months in the job because I couldn't do anything. It was constantly just dealing with emergencies. You couldn't actually. I like talking to people. I like getting to know people. But when you're dealing with those situations, it's just constant emergency. And a lot of people are on a lot of the emergencies. A lot of people that are on prescription drugs are causing a lot of the. Well, they end up heavily addicted on them. So. In Longford, Westmeath, there was a statistic from maybe I think it was a few years ago, which said 1 in 11 people are on anxiety or antidepressant drugs. So about 9% of people. So big pharma in Ireland, like one of the major influences for all this sort of stuff is big pharma. They've worked to make profits for themselves, and they're one of the most nefarious forces in the world, really, the pharmaceutical industry. They're a multi-billion-dollar industry who are very, very clever, push a lot of propaganda, understand human psychology really well, understand also how to make associations between their brand and health. So you'll see the likes of Abbott, for example, will sponsor things like the Longford Marathon. I know Abbott are a big employer in Longford, so it's controversial maybe, but they would sponsor things like the marathon. And they also had 2 years ago, they had like there was a volunteer of the year in Longford. It's a regular thing every year, but 2 years ago there was an Abbott like one of the managers in Abbott got the nomination, or he won the award for volunteer of the year. All it said was he went to business meetings locally. You know what it was like? Well, the person that was the runner-up was like somebody that was involved in community, organizing marathon races or organizing charity runs. And it just struck me that if they're just trying to associate their brand with health and goodness, they're very, very clever, very, very good at what they do. And I mention Abbott because Abbott did get fined $1.5 billion. Back, I think it was back in the 90s, for targeting nursing homes with drugs that the people in the nursing homes didn't need, and the drugs that would cause all sorts of serious side effects as well. So they got fined $1.5 billion. So this is what's happening, and the brand is very good, but you have to dig a bit to find out what they're actually doing. So the pharmaceutical industry are very, very powerful in that regard. They just have a lot of influence in Ireland as well because they employ so many people as well. Some of the results as well. I want to share this with you because I think it's good for people to know about what's going on behind the scenes, and seeing as though I've been in the field for a while, it's useful to see these things. I don't want everybody to go. There is a I will end on what to do, and I don't want to really go out there just depressed and actually I need to go see a psychiatrist now. That's not what I want to get to. But I do want to show people what's going on. Right? And one of the things is sometimes by focusing on the biological part of thing, focusing on the medical part of thing, we miss the person. We completely miss the person sometimes. So, for example, there was in New Zealand there was a study done with white Europeans, like of people of white European descendancy and people of Pacific Islander descendancy, and it showed that the Pacific Islanders were 3 times more likely to have attempted suicide than the white European people of white European descent. And then there was a big campaign about let's get the Pacific Islanders and people from Tonga, Samoa, islands near New Zealand. Let's get them into the services. Let's get them in because obviously they need the services. And that's but by going into the services, they're more likely to get diagnosed and drugged up. That's more likely what happened. But then I looked at some other statistics from a survey done with teenagers in schools, and I looked at how likely were Pacific Islanders compared to white Europeans who've experienced abuse in their home, or to have seen violence in their home, or to be eating fast food like daily, and they were 3 to 4 times more likely than white Europeans to experience violence in their home, to experience sexual abuse in their home, and to be eating like absolute junk as well. So like it wasn't a medical problem. It was because they were experiencing these environments. If you make it a medical problem, you miss the trauma and the other things that are going on for these people. So you just have to. That's the elephant in the room that sometimes gets missed. I have a big picture of an elephant as well to get some other. I worked on these slides, but you can just imagine an elephant there. But one of the worst pretty error, the worst result of the errors that happened is, and I'll just read this quote. It's from a book. It's a book called My Life with Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, by a woman called Carol Robinson. Excellent book, brilliant book. It's well worth reading if anybody wants to have a look at it. But she says, the general method of psychiatry and psychology is the same used by physical scientists. It is to explain away higher things like holiness, morality, self-sacrifice, or remorse by giving an explanation in a lower order. So it's explaining away the soul. Like that's what a lot of this stuff is doing, and it explains away remorse. It explains away guilt. It explains away anxiety by just saying it's a medical problem. Now, I'm not always saying it's not a medical problem. I don't want to go away saying that, because sometimes it could very well be a medical problem, but oftentimes it's not. And sometimes it's because somebody has remorse about something. Something's digging at them. Their conscience is at them for something they did. And that's just a natural thing. That's a natural thing to say, all right, there's something I need to investigate here. It's not to jump in to say, oh, it's a medical problem, because that just kicks the can down the road an awful lot of times. So yeah, what to do about this then? Yeah, I've kind of had my bit of a rant. But it's kind of saying what to do about this. As I said earlier, I don't want people to go away and just be like, you can ask your doctor questions. You can ask your doctor questions about certain medication. Like, how do they know this medication is suitable? Ask them any of the side effects of the medication. Also, you have to be careful because they often get their information from medical journals, and there was a editor-in-chief of one of the top journals, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine, and he said that 50% of what's in the medical journals is unreliable. So you just have to be a bit wary. You just have to be a bit careful when you're, it's not the doctor that sometimes doesn't know. The doctors and the pharmacists are the most marketed. They're the most targeted by the pharmaceutical companies. They're given trips away. They're given all sorts of incentives to prescribe these drugs. And some of the medical professionals are trying to push back against that because they know how bad it is. But they're bound to be affected by it. And it's like the pharmacists, they're clever. They're very clever. They know how to get people on their side. So just be that bit careful. I'll give a couple of websites that might be of use for people as well. You can check out. It's from reliable sources. It's from professors of psychiatry or professors of medical research. They're actually pushing back against what's currently happening in the medical world. So I'll give you those that information if you want them. Also, it's kind of like it's kind of stop looking for quick fixes. Like sometimes you just have to be patient and persevere. Sometimes things are bad for a while, and you know, somebody might offer you a magic pill, but oftentimes it's not the solution. It can make things a hell of a lot worse. So sometimes you have to persevere, and sometimes you just have to be sometimes it's just carrying that cross for a while. That's sometimes like, I'm not saying if your leg's half falling off, like no, you know, get yourself to a doctor. But sometimes you have to just persevere and break through these things. And I just have to be careful with the pharmaceutical propaganda. They're very clever. They've got a lot of they have patient advocacy groups as well that work on the ground, kind of pretend to be local groups. They're good. They're good at what they do. They're very good. It is. It's just like the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil, and a lot of it is. There's a lot of greed, and a lot of ignorance as well. To be fair, but it's a lot of greed there.
A lot of it's the easy option as well.
Yeah, it's a quick fix. They're offering you a quick fix, and that's good. Some people like if you're offered a quick fix and it does look reliable and it looks like something that's safe. Oftentimes you just go for it because you just believe it will solve things, and sometimes sometimes I would say, I'm one for, sometimes you do need something to just, just numb you for a wee while, just like something like, stiff whiskey is something's good. And sometimes you might need something like Valium or some sort of medication like that, just to take the edge off so you get a couple of nights sleep. You get something just to get your head down, things like that. But just long term, you wouldn't recommend anybody long term to have 3 pints a day, or you wouldn't half a bottle of whiskey a day. You wouldn't be recommending that to solve your problems, So that's the way I would treat it, and I know that's the way some psychiatrists that are kind of speaking out against what's going on would treat it as well. They're a minority, those psychiatrists, but they are speaking out. So. And I'll finish that. Basically, what I'm trying to get at, and it's just to understand that once you don't understand human beings correctly, then all sorts of problems happens after that. So it's understanding that human beings are not just a biological entity, but we have a body and a soul, and what the soul needs nourishment, and what the soul needs, and that's the soul needs truth. That's the nourishment the soul needs. So I hope by presenting this, I've given you some insight into what's going on and given you some truth. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So.